Hi, my name is Amanda Fuller, and I'm going to be showing you an example of how to give a persuasive speech. According to the organization Born Free, where their purpose is to show compassion and respect to animals in capacity or in the wild, they inform people that 2 giraffe subspecies have been listed as critically endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Time magazine states that the list of endangered species has more than doubled in the past 2 decades. Most have the assumption that zoos are to help animals that are put on the endangered species list through the usage of breeding to then be sent back into the wild. However, this is not true. Zoos breed animals simply for entertainment, to bring individuals into their enclosures to learn about the animals and see the baby animals as well, showing individuals a false view of how animals truly live out in the wild. Although zoos are meant for educational purposes while also providing most endangered and regular animals a place to live, zoos are overall not helpful in wildlife conservation due to human interference, which prevents animals from a natural life, not providing sufficient space, and breeding of wild animals. Wildlife conservation is not being fulfilled through zoos. Human interference plays a big role on why zoos are harmful in wildlife conservation. Wildlife conservation is defined as the practice of protecting animal species and their habitats according to the National Humane Education Society. What some zoos are teaching people is that it is okay to interfere with wildlife by putting the animals in enclosures. The way that some zookeepers treat the animals in the enclosures is shown to be inhumane. For example, over at the Hanover Adventure Zoo in Germany, a hidden video camera caught handlers beating their elephants in order to get them to do tricks. National Geographic explains that the video reveals zookeepers yanking young elephants' heads to the grounds, thrusting sharp training tools called bull hooks into their necks, and using whips to perform circus-like tricks. Another example of how handlers are not protecting their animals, but they are hurting them, is shown in Venezuela, at the Caraco Zoo in Caracas, Venezuela, on July 12, 2016. This image was taken of a lion starving from a food shortage. Eliana Zakos, writer for National Geographic, explains that about 50 animals at that zoo had to starve for 6 weeks due to the rise of food costs. Even though that is an obstacle that the zoo had to face, most companies are prepared in times of emergency. Just because these are animals and not humans, it does not mean that they can go without food. Wildlife conservation is meant to protect animals and protect their habitats. By abusing the animals for entertainment purposes, or starving the animals because of a food shortage, that does not protect them. It harms them severely. Some zoos are not only abusing their animals physically, but they are also abusing their animals emotionally. They are doing this by making their enclosures too small for living. Freedom for Animals explains that zoos cannot begin to provide the amount of space that animals have out in the wild. Tigers and lions have around 18,000 times less space in zoos than they would out in the wild. Polar bears have 1 million times less space than they would out in the wild. It is common to see pretty paintings of the jungle, Antarctica, maybe deserts on the walls to make their enclosures seem bigger for the animals, but they're not fooled. Behavioral biologist Georgia Mason and Ross Clubb of the University of Oxford, UK, reason that how well animals adapt to zoo life might vary on how they live out in the wild. If the animals tend to roam a far distance out in the wild, like polar bears, they struggle in captivity because they are not given the opportunity to roam. Recently, I went to the Como Zoo in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I walked around the zoo observing the animals' behaviors, and I found this information to be true. When I went to the polar bear exhibit, the 2 polar bears that were there were either pacing or sleeping, faced away from the people. This was my second time going to the zoo in the past 2 months, and the 2 bears have had the exact same behavior. I observed them for quite some time, and their behavior did not change. It could have been their resting time, but that does not justify for the consistent pacing in the enclosure. This was also found to be true for the gorillas. Although their exhibit seemed to be big for the human eye, a typical gorilla is known to travel about 30% of their day, according to Encounter Africa. In the enclosure built for gorillas, they would most likely not be able to fulfill that 30% because of their enclosures being too small. When animals are not given the proper space for living, it causes them to fall into depression, which is a sign of mental distress, which could potentially lead to sickness or even death. With the enclosures being too small, it is overall harming these animals, not protecting them. That is not what wildlife conservation stands for. Another way that wildlife conservation is not being implemented in zoos is through breeding. Breeding can be good for endangered species, but not the way that most zoos breed. Those zoos are known to breed endangered animals. Those zoos that are known to breed endangered animals do not send them back into the wild, but rather keep them to bring visitors in. When one is to see a cute little baby giraffe, they're most likely not going to run from it. They're going to be intrigued by it. By breeding wild animals, it brings more revenue to those zoo companies, allowing them to make a profit out of the baby animals. Even if the zookeepers were to breed animals to eventually bring them out into the zoos, bring them out into the wild, it would be a disaster. The reason being is because most zoos are not set up like real wildlife habitats. They try to replicate it looks-wise, but in reality it comes nowhere near to what the wildlife environment is. If these breeders were to send out their animals into the wildlife, they would be prone to new diseases and have to adapt to a new atmosphere, which some animals can do, but most would not be able to survive very long in those types of conditions. Breeding does not help wildlife conservation because it is not protecting the animals, it is protecting human profit. The endangered animals will still continue to decrease out in the wild, and then all that will be left are the ones in zoos, eventually the species becoming extinct. In defense of zoos, on the website Western Howl, an article was written by Lake Larson. She brings up valid points on what zoos try to implement and show their visitors. Something that she explains is that without education and awareness, the decline of animal species around the globe will continue. Zoos are supposed to teach individuals about the animals. However, by showing animals that have not come from the wild and that are living in spaces that don't replicate the wild, those zoos are showing a false image of how animals would be out in that environment. Therefore, teaching people the wrong ways of how to protect animals and how to protect their habitats. She also explains that zoos and aquariums put money into helping wild species. According to the AZA website, $216 million is put into conservation projects every single year. There are currently 115 reintroduction programs, and more than 40 of these are for threatened or endangered species. It is wonderful to hear that money is going towards helping the animals in the wild. But what about the animals present in the zoo? From what I explained before, through abusing these animals physically and emotionally, also through breeding in zoos, those facilities are being hypocrites. If one is to say they are doing something but not reciprocating the action that they had said, it is putting a false image upon themselves. Just because they are helping other animals in the wild does not mean that in the long run they're helping the animals in the zoos. Even though some zookeepers have good intentions of what they want to teach people from around the world, they're hurting these animals overall, not protecting them. Even though zoos are meant to educate individuals and give a space for animals to live, they are not helpful when it comes to wildlife conservation. Since most of the zoo facilities have human interference, small enclosures, and also breed the wildlife, they are not showing an example of wildlife conservation. Protection is meant for all animals, not just the ones outside of the cage. Thank you.